The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 3, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 12, Side 1. Chapter 39, the last chapter, Dante, 1265 to 1321. 1. The Italian Troubadours. It was at the Apulian court of Frederick II that Italian literature was born. Perhaps the Moslems in his retinue contributed some stimulus, for every literate Moslem versified. Some years before Frederick's death in 1250, Ciullo d'Alcamo, circa 1200, wrote a pretty dialogue between lover and lady, and Alcamo in Sicily was almost wholly a Moslem town. But a more decisive influence came from the troubadours of Provence, who sent their poems or came in person to the appreciative Frederick and his cultured aides. Frederick himself not only supported poetry, he wrote it, and in Italian. His prime minister, Piero delle Vigne, composed excellent sonnets and may have invented that arduous form. Rinaldo d'Aquino, brother to St. Thomas, living at Frederick's court, Guido delle Colonne, a judge, and Jacopo da Lentino, a notary in Frederick's Regno, were among the poets of this Apulian Renaissance. A sonnet by Jacopo, circa 1233, a generation before Dante's birth, has already the delicacy of sentiment and finish of form of the poems in the Vita Nuova. I have it in my heart to serve God so that into paradise I shall repair, the holy place through the which everywhere I have heard say that joy and solace flow. Without my lady I were loath to go, she who has the bright face and the bright hair, because if she were absent, I being there, my pleasure would be less than naught, I know. Look you, I say not this to such intent as that I there would deal in any sin. I only would behold her gracious mien, and beautiful soft eyes and lovely face, that so it should be my complete content to see my lady joyful in her place. When Frederick's court traveled through Italy, he took poets along with his menagerie, and they spread their influence into Latium, Tuscany, and Lombardy. His son Manfred continued his patronage of poetry, and wrote lyrics that Dante praised. Much of this Sicilian verse was translated into Tuscan, and shared in forming the school of poets that culminated in Dante. At the same time, French troubadours, leaving a Languedoc harried by religious wars, found refuge in Italian courts, initiated Italian poets into the gai saber, taught Italian women to welcome verse eulogies, and persuaded Italian magnates to reward poetry even when addressed to their wives. Some early Tuscan poets carried their imitation of the French troubadours so far as to write in Provençal. Sordello, circa 1200 to 1270, born near Virgil's Mantua, offended the terrible Ezzelino, fled to Provence, and wrote in Provençal poems of ethereal and fleshless love. Out of this Platonic passion, by a strange marriage of metaphysics and poetry, came the dolce stil nuovo, or sweet new style of Tuscany. Instead of the frank sensuality which they found in the Provençal singers, the Italian poets preferred or pretended to love women as embodiments of pure and abstract beauty, or as symbols of divine wisdom or philosophy. This was a new note in an Italy that had known 100,000 poets of love. Perhaps the spirit of St. Francis moved these chaste pens, or the Summa of Thomas weighed upon them, or they felt the influence of Arabic mystics who saw only God in beauty and wrote love poems to the deity. A bevy of learned singers constituted the new school. Guido Guinizelli, 1230 to 1275, of Bologna, whom Dante saluted as his literary father, rhymed the new philosophy of love in a famous canzone, the Provençal canzo, or song, of the gentle heart, where he asked God's pardon for loving his lady so, on the plea that she seemed an embodiment of divinity. Lappagiani, Dino Frescobaldi, Guido Orlandi, Cino da Pistoia, spread the new style through northern Italy. It was brought to Florence by its finest pre-Dantean exponent, Guido Cavalcanti, circa 1258 to 1300, Dante's friend. By exception among these scholar poets, Guido was a noble, son-in-law of that Farinata degli Uberti, who led the Ghibelline faction in Florence. He was an Averroistic freethinker, and played with doubts of immortality, even of God. He took an active, violent part in politics, was exiled by Dante and the other priors in 1300, fell ill, was pardoned, and died in that same year. His proud, aristocratic mind was well fitted to mold sonnets of cold and classic grace. Beauty in woman, the high will's decree, fair knighthood armed for manly exercise, the pleasant song of birds, love's soft replies, the strength of rapid ships upon the sea, the serene air when light begins to be, the white snow without wind that falls and lies, fields of all flowers, the place where waters rise, silver and gold, azure in jewelry. Weighed against these, the sweet and quiet worth which my dear lady cherishes at heart might seem a little matter to be shown, being truly over these as much apart as the whole heaven is greater than this earth. All good to kindred creatures cleaveth soon. Dante learned much from Guido, imitated his canzoni, and perhaps owed to him the decision to write the Divine Comedy in Italian. He desired, says Dante, that I should always write to him in the vernacular speech, not in Latin. In the course of the 13th century, Dante's predecessors molded the new tongue from rude inadequacy to such melody of speech, such concentration and subtlety of phrase, as no other European vernacular could match. They created a language that Dante could call illustrious, cardinal, courtly, and curial, fit for the highest dignities. Beside their sonnets, the verses of the Provençaux were inharmonious, those of the Trouvère and the Minnesingers almost doggerel. Here poetry had become no rhyming rivulet of gay garrulity, but a work of intense and compact art as painstakingly carved as the figures on the pulpits of Niccolò Pisano and his son. Partly a great man is great because those less than he have paved his way, have molded the mood of the time to his genius, have fashioned an instrument for his hands, and have given him a task already half done. 2. Dante and Beatrice. In May 1265, Bella Alighieri presented to her husband, Alighiero Alighieri, a son whom they christened Durante Alighieri. Probably they took no thought that the words meant long-lasting wing-bearer. Apparently the poet himself shortened his first name to Dante. His family had a lengthy pedigree in Florence, but had slipped into poverty. The mother died in Dante's early years. Alighiero married again, and Dante grew up, perhaps unhappily, with a stepmother, a half-brother, and 2 half-sisters. The father died when Dante was 15, leaving a heritage of debts. Of Dante's teachers he remembered most gratefully Brunetto Latini, who, returning from France, had shortened his French encyclopedia, Trésor, into an Italian Tesoretto. From him Dante learned Come l'uom s'eterna, how man immortalizes himself. Dante must have studied Virgil with especial delight. He speaks of the Mantuan's bel stilo, and what other student has so loved a classic as to follow its author through hell? Boccaccio tells of Dante being at Bologna in 1287. There or elsewhere the poet picked up so much of the sorry science and miraculous philosophy of his time that his poem became top-heavy with his erudition. He learned also to ride, hunt, fence, paint, and sing. How he earned his bread we do not know. In any case, he was admitted to cultured circles, if only through his friendship with Cavalcanti. In that circle he found many poets. The most famous of all love affairs began when both Dante and Beatrice were 9 years old. According to Boccaccio, the occasion was a May Day feast in the home of Folco Portinari, one of the leading citizens of Florence. Little Bice was Folco's daughter. That she was also Dante's Beatrice is probable, but not close enough to certainty to calm the doubts of the meticulous. We know of this first meeting only through the idealized description written by Dante 9 years later in his Vita Nuova. Her dress on that day was of a most noble color, a subdued and goodly crimson, girdled and adorned in such sort as suited with her very tender age. At that moment I say most truly that the spirit of life, which hath its dwelling in the secretest chamber of the heart, began to tremble so violently that the least pulses of my body shook therewith, and in trembling it said these words, Ecce Deus fortior me, qui veniens dominabitur mihi. Behold a deity stronger than I, who, coming, will rule me. From that time forward, love quite governed my soul. A lad nearing puberty is ripe for such trembling. Most of us have known it, and can look back upon calf love as one of the most spiritual experiences of our youth, a mysterious awakening of body and soul to life and sex and beauty, and our individual incompleteness, and yet with no conscious hunger of body for body, but only a shy longing to be near the beloved, to serve her, and hear her speak, and watch her modest grace. Give the male soul such sensitivity as Dante's, a man of passion and imagination, and such a revelation and ripening might well remain a lifelong memory and stimulus. He tells us how he sought opportunities to see Beatrice, if only to gaze unseen upon her. Then he seems to have lost sight of her until, 9 years later, when they were 18. It happened that the same wonderful lady appeared to me dressed all in pure white, between 2 gentle, that is high-born, ladies elder than she. and passing through a street she turned her eyes thither, where I stood sorely abashed. And by her unspeakable courtesy she saluted me with so virtuous a bearing that I seemed then and there to behold the very limits of blessedness. I parted thence as one intoxicated. Then, for that I had myself in some sort the art of discoursing with rhyme, I resolved on making a sonnet. So, if we may believe his account, was born his sequence of sonnets and commentaries known as La Vita Nuova, the New Life. At intervals in the next 9 years, from 1283 to 1292, he composed the sonnets and later added the prose. He sent one sonnet after another to Cavalcanti, who preserved them and now became his friend. The whole romance is in some measure a literary artifice. The poems are spoiled for our changed taste by their fanciful deification of love in the manner of the troubadours, by the long scholastic dissertations that interpret them, and by a number mysticism of 3s and 9s. We must discount these infections of the time. Love saith concerning her, How chanceth it that flesh, which is of dust, should be thus pure? Then, gazing always, he makes oath, For sure, this is a creature of God till now unknown. She hath that paleness of the pearl that's fit in a fair woman, so much and not more. She is as high as nature and skill can soar. Beauty is tried by her comparison. Whatever her sweet eyes are turned upon, spirits of love do issue thence in flame, which, through their eyes who then may look on them, pierce to the heart's deep chamber every one. And in her smile love's image you may see, whence none can gaze upon her steadfastly. Some of the prose is more pleasing than the verse. When she appeared in any place, it seemed to me, by the hope of her excellent salutation, that there was no man mine enemy any longer, and such warmth of charity came upon me that most certainly in that moment I would have pardoned whosoever had done me an injury. She went along crowned and clothed with humility, and when she had gone, it was said by many, This is not a woman, but one of the beautiful angels of heaven. I say of very sooth that she showed herself so very gentle that she bred in those who looked upon her a soothing quiet beyond any speech. There is no thought in this possibly artificial infatuation of marriage with Beatrice. In 1289 she wedded Simone de Bardi, member of a rich banking firm. Dante took no notice of so superficial an incident, but continued to write poems about her without mentioning her name. A year later Beatrice died, aged 24, and the poet, for the first time naming her, mourned her in a quiet elegy. Beatrice has gone up into high heaven, the kingdom where the angels are at peace, and lives with them, and to her friends is dead. Not by the frost of winter was she driven away, like others, nor by summer heats, but through a perfect gentleness instead. For from the lamp of her meek lowly head such an exceeding glory went up hence, that it woke wonder in the eternal Sire, until a sweet desire entered him for that lovely excellence, so that he bade her to himself aspire, counting this weary and most evil place unworthy of a thing so full of grace. In another poem he pictured her surrounded with homage in paradise. After writing this sonnet, he tells us, it was given unto me to behold a very wonderful vision, wherein I saw things which determined me that I would say nothing further of this blessed one until such time as I could discourse more worthily concerning her. And to this end I labor all I can, as she well knoweth. Wherefore, if it be his pleasure, through whom is the life of all things, that my life continue with me a few years, it is my hope that I shall yet write concerning her what hath not before been written of any woman. After the which may it seem good unto him who is the master of grace, that my spirit shall go hence to behold the glory of its lady, to wit, of that blessed Beatrice, who now gazeth continually on his countenance. So in the concluding words of his little book he laid his sights for a greater one, and from the first day that I saw her face in this life until this vision, with which he ends the Paradiso, the sequence of my song was never cut. Rarely has any man, through all the tides and storms in his affairs, charted and kept so straight a course. 3. The poet in politics. However, there were deviations. Some time after Beatrice's death, Dante indulged himself in a series of light loves, Pietra, Pargoletta, Lisetta, or other vanity of such brief use. To one lady, whom he names only Gentildonna, he addressed love poems less ethereal than those to Beatrice. About 1291, aged 26, he married Gemma Donati, a descendant of the oldest Florentine aristocracy. In 10 years she gave him several children, variously reckoned at 3, 4, or 7. Faithful to the troubadour code, he never mentioned his wife or his children in his poetry. It would have been indelicate. Marriage and romantic love were things apart. Now, perhaps through Cavalcanti's aid, he entered politics. For reasons unknown to us, he joined the Whites, or Bianchi, the party of the upper middle class. He must have had ability, for as early as 1300 he was elected to the priory or municipal council. During his brief incumbency, the Blacks, or Neri, led by Corso Donati, attempted a coup d'etat to restore the old nobility to power. After suppressing this revolt, the priors, Dante concurring, sought to promote peace by banishing the leaders of both parties, among them Donati, Dante's relative by marriage, and Cavalcanti, his friend. In 1301, Donati invaded Florence with a band of armed blacks, deposed the priors, and captured the government. Early in 1302, Dante and 15 other citizens were tried and convicted on various political charges, were exiled, and were sentenced to be burned to death if they should ever enter Florence again. Dante fled, and, hoping soon to return, left his family behind him. This exile, with confiscation of his property, condemned the poet to indigent wandering for 19 years, embittered his spirit, and in some measure determined the mood and theme of the Divine Comedy. His fellow exiles, against Dante's advice, persuaded Arezzo, Bologna, and Pistoia to send against Florence an army of 10,000 men to restore them to power or their homes, this in 1304. The attempt failed, and thereafter Dante followed an individual course, living with friends in Arezzo, Bologna, and Padua. It was during the first decade of his exile that he gathered together some of the poems he had written to the Gentildonna, and added to them a prose commentary transforming her into Dame Philosophy. The Convivio, or Banquet, circa 1308, tells how, in the disappointments of love and life, Dante turned to philosophy for solace, what a divine revelation he found in the seductive study, and how he resolved to share his findings in Italian with those who could not read Latin. Apparently, he had in mind to write a new Summa, or Tesoro, in which each part would pretend to be a commentary on a poem about the beautiful lady. It was a remarkable scheme for redeeming the sensuous with the arid. The little book is a hodgepodge of weird science, far-fetched allegories, and snatches of philosophy from Boethius and Cicero. We must mark it as a credit to Dante's intelligence that after completing 3 of 14 intended commentaries, he abandoned the book as a total loss. He took on now the modest task of re-establishing the rule of the Holy Roman Emperors in Italy. His experience had convinced him that the chaos and violence of politics in the Italian cities were due to an atomistic conception of freedom, each region, city, class, individual, and desire demanding anarchic liberty. Like Machiavelli 2 centuries later, he longed for some power that would coordinate individuals, classes, and cities into an orderly whole within which men might work and live in security and peace. That unifying power could come either from the Pope or from the head of the Holy Roman Empire, to which northern Italy had long been subject in theory. But Dante had just been exiled by a party allied with the papacy. An uncertain tradition says that he had taken part in an unsuccessful embassy from Florence to Boniface VIII, and for a long time the popes had opposed the unification of Italy as a danger to their spiritual freedom as well as their temporal power. The only hope of order seemed to lie in the restoration of imperial control, in a return to the majestic Pax Romana of ancient Rome. So, at a date unknown, Dante wrote his provocative treatise, De Monarchia. Writing in Latin, as still the language of philosophy, Dante argued that since the appropriate function of man is intellectual activity, and since this can proceed only in peace, the ideal government would be a world state maintaining a stable order and uniform justice over all the earth. Such a state would be the proper image and correlate of the celestial order established throughout the universe by God. Imperial Rome had come nearest to being such an international state. God's approval of it was made manifest by his choosing to become man under Augustus, and Christ himself had bidden man accept the political authority of the Caesars. Obviously, the authority of the ancient empire had not been derived from the Church, but the Holy Roman Empire was that older empire revived. It is true that a pope crowned Charlemagne, and thereby appeared to make the empire subordinate to the papacy, but the usurpation of a right does not create a right. If it did, the same method could show the dependency of ecclesiastical authority on the empire after the Emperor Otto restored Pope Leo and deposed Benedict. The right of the empire to govern was derived not from the Church, but from the natural law that social order requires government. And since natural law is the will of God, the state derives its powers from God. It is indeed proper that the emperor should acknowledge the superior authority of the pope in matters of faith and morals, but this does not limit the sovereignty of the state in the earthly sphere. The De Monarchia, despite a scholastic mechanism of disputation no longer appetizing to the fashions of thought, was a powerful argument for one world of government and law. The manuscript was known only to a few during the author's lifetime. After his death it was more widely circulated and was used as propaganda by the anti-papal Louis the Bavarian. It was publicly burned by order of a papal legate in 1329, was placed on the papal index of forbidden books in the 16th century, and was removed from that index by Leo XIII in 1897. According to Boccaccio, Dante wrote the De Monarchia at the coming of Henry VI. In the year 1310, the King of Germany invaded Italy in the hope of re-establishing over all the peninsula, except the Papal States, that imperial rule which had died with Frederick II. Dante welcomed him with excited hopes. In a letter to the princes and peoples of Italy, he called upon the Lombard cities to open their hearts and gates to the Luxembourg Arrigo, who would deliver them from chaos and the Pope. When Henry reached Milan, Dante hastened thither and threw himself enthusiastically at the feet of the emperor. All his dreams of a united Italy seemed near fulfillment. Florence, heedless of the poet, closed her gates against Henry, and Dante publicly addressed an angry letter, Celestissimis Florentinis, to the most criminal Florentines in March of 1311. Know ye not that God hath ordained that the human race be under the rule of one emperor for the defense of justice, peace, and civilization, and that Italy has always been a prey to civil war whenever the empire lapsed? You who transgress laws human and divine, you whom the awful insatiability of avarice has led to be ready for any crimes, does not the terror of the second death harass you, that ye, first and alone, have raged against the glory of the Roman prince, the monarch of the earth and the ambassador of God? Most foolish and insensate men, ye shall succumb perforce to the imperial eagle. To Dante's dismay, Henry took no action against Florence. In April, the poet wrote to the emperor like a Hebrew prophet warning kings. We marvel what sluggishness delays you so long. You waste the spring as well as the winter at Milan. Florence, do you perchance know it not, is the dire evil. This is the viper. From her evaporating corruption she exhales an infectious smoke, and thence the neighboring flocks waste away. Up then, thou noble child of Jesse. Florence responded by declaring Dante forever excluded from amnesty and from Florence. Henry left Florence untouched, and passed via Genoa and Pisa to Rome and Siena, where he died in 1313. It was a crowning disaster for Dante. He had staked everything on Henry's victory, had burned all bridges to Florence behind him. He fled to Gubbio, and took refuge in the monastery of Santa Croce. There, apparently, he wrote much of the Divine Comedy. But he had not yet had his fill of politics. In 1316, he was probably with Uguccione della Fagiuola at Lucca. In that year, Uguccione defeated the Florentines at Montecatini. Florence recovered, and included Dante's two sons in a sentence of death, which was never carried out. Lucca revolted against Uguccione, and Dante was again homeless. Florence, in a mood of victorious generosity, and forgetting its forevers, offered amnesty and safe return to all exiles on condition that they pay a fine, walk through the streets in penitential garb, and submit to a brief imprisonment. A friend notified Dante of the proclamation. He replied in a famous letter, To a Florentine friend, from your letter, which I received with due reverence and affection, I have learned with a grateful heart how dear to your soul is my return to my country. Behold, then, the ordinance, that if I were willing to pay a certain amount of money and suffer the stigma of oblation, I should be pardoned, and could return forthwith. Is this, then, the glorious recall wherewith Dante Alighieri is summoned back to his country after an exile patiently endured for almost 15 years? Far be it from a man who preaches justice to pay his money to those inflicting injustice, as though they were his benefactors. This is not the way to return to my country. If another way may be found which does not derogate from the honor of Dante, that will I take with no lagging steps. But if Florence is not to be entered by such a path, then never will I enter. What, can I not look upon the face of the sun and the stars everywhere? Can I not under any sky contemplate the most precious truths? Probably toward the close of the year 1316, he accepted the invitation of Congrande della Scala, ruler of Verona, to come and live as his guest. There, apparently, he finished, there he dedicated to Congrande, the Paradiso of the Divine Comedy in 1318. We may picture him at this period, aged 51, as Boccaccio described him in the Vita of 1354. A man of medium height, somewhat stooped, walking with grave and measured gait in somber dignity, dark hair and skin, long and pensive face, furrowed, projecting brow, deep, stern eyes, thin, aquiline nose, tight lips, a pugnacious chin. It was the face of a spirit once gentle, but hardened to bitterness by pain. The Dante of the Vita Nuova could hardly have affected all the tenderness and sensibility there expressed, and something of those qualities appears in the pity with which he hears Francesca's tale. He was grim and austere as became a defeated exile. His tongue was sharpened by adversity, and he became imperious to cover his fall from power. He prided himself on his ancestry because he was poor. He despised the money-making bourgeoisie of Florence. He could not forgive Portinari for marrying Beatrice to a banker, and he took the only revenge open to him by placing usurers in one of the deepest pits of hell. He never forgot an injury or a slight, and there were few of his enemies who escaped damnation from his pen. He had less use than Solon for those who remained neutral in revolution or in war. The secret of his character was a flaming intensity. Not by the grace of riches, but by the grace of God I am what I am, and the zeal of his house hath eaten me up. He poured all his strength into his poem, and could not long survive its completion. In 1319 he left Verona and went to live with Count Guido da Polenta at Ravenna. He received an invitation from Bologna to come and be crowned poet laureate. He answered no in a Latin eclogue. In 1321 Guido sent him to Venice on a political mission, which failed. Dante returned with a fever caught from the marshes of the Veneto. He was too weak to fight it off, and it killed him on September 14th, 1321, in the 57th year of his age. The Count planned to raise a handsome tomb above the poet's grave, but it was not done. The bas-relief that stands above the marble coffin today was carved by Pietro Lombardo in 1483. There, as all the world knows, Byron came and wept. Today the tomb lies almost unnoticed around the corner from Ravenna's busiest square, and its old and crippled custodian, for a few lire, will recite sonorous beauties from the poem that all men praise and few men read. 4. The Divine Comedy. 1. The Poem. Boccaccio relates that Dante began it in Latin hexameters, but changed to Italian to reach a broader audience. Perhaps the ardor of his feelings affected his choice. It seemed easier to be passionate in Italian than in a Latin so long associated with classic urbanity and restraint. In youth he had restricted Italian to the poetry of love, but now that his theme was the highest philosophy of human redemption through love, he wondered, dared he speak in the vulgar tongue? At some uncertain time he had begun, and then left unfinished, a Latin essay, De Vulgari Eloquentia, on vernacular eloquence, aspiring to win the learned to wider literary use of the vernacular. He had praised the compact majesty of Latin, but had expressed the hope that through the poetry of Frederic's Regno and the stil nuovo of the Lombard and Tuscan trovatori, an Italian language might rise above its dialects to be, as the Convivio put it, full of the sweetest and most exquisite beauty. Even Dante's pride could hardly dream that his epic would not only make Italian a language fit for any enterprise of letters, but would raise it to such dolce bellezza as the world's literature has seldom known. Never was a poem more painstakingly planned. A weakness for triads, as reflecting the Trinity, molded its form. There were to be 3 canticles, each of 33 cantos, to correspond with the years of Christ's earthly life. An extra canto in the first canticle would make a neat round 100. Each canto was to be written in groups of 3 lines, and the second line of each group was to rhyme with the first and third of the next. Nothing could be more artificial, yet all art is artifice, though at its best concealed, and the terza rima, or triple rhyme, binds each stanza with its successor, and weaves them all into a continued song, or canto, which in the original flows trippingly on the tongue, but in translation limps and halts on borrowed feet. Dante in advance condemned all translations of Dante. Nothing that hath the harmony of musical connection can be transferred from its own tongue to another without shattering all its sweetness and harmony. We should accept Dante Gabriel Rossetti's translations of the Vita Nuova and of Dante's predecessors. As number dictated the form, so allegory planned the tale. In his dedicatory epistle to Can Grande, Dante explained the symbolism of his canticles. We might suspect this interpretation to be the afterthought of a poet who longed to be a philosopher. But the addiction of the Middle Ages to symbolism, the allegorical sculptures of the cathedrals, the allegorical frescoes of Giotto, Gaddi, and Raphael, and Dante's allegorical sublimations in the Vita Nuova and the Convivio, suggest that the poet really had in mind the outlines of the scheme that he described in perhaps imaginary detail. The poem, he says, belongs to the genus philosophy, and its concern is morality. Like a theologian interpreting the Bible, he assigns three meanings to his words: the literal, the allegorical, and the mystical. The subject of this work, according to the letter, is the state of souls after death. But if the work be taken allegorically, its subject is man, insofar as by merit or demerit he is exposed to the rewards or punishments of justice. The aim of the whole and the part is to remove those living in this life from a state of misery and to guide them to a state of happiness. Otherwise expressed, the inferno is man passing through sin, suffering, and despair. The purgatorio is his cleansing through faith, and the paradiso is his redemption through divine revelation and unselfish love. Virgil, who guides Dante through hell and purgatory, stands for knowledge, reason, wisdom, which can lead us to the portals of happiness. Only faith and love, Beatrice, can lead us in. In the epic of Dante's life, his exile was his hell, his studies and his writings were his purgation, his hope and love were his redemption and his only bliss. It is perhaps because Dante takes his symbolism most seriously in the Paradiso that this canticle is the hardest to enjoy. For the Beatrice, who was a heavenly vision in the Vita Nuova, becomes in Dante's vision of heaven a pompous abstraction, hardly a meet fate for such impeccable loveliness. Finally, Dante explains to Cangrande why he calls his epic commedia. The adjective divina was added by admirers in the 17th century. Because the story passed from misery to happiness, and because it is written in a careless and humble style in the vulgar tongue which even housewives can speak. This painful comedy, this book on which I have grown thin through all these years, was the work and solace of his exile, and was finished only 3 years before his death. It summarized his life, his learning, his theology, his philosophy. If it had also embodied the humor and tenderness and full-blooded sensuality of the Middle Ages, it might have been a medieval synthesis. Into these 100 brief cantos, Dante crowded the science that he had gathered from Brunetto Latini, and perhaps from Bologna, the astronomy, cosmology, geology, and chronology of an age too busy living to be learned. He accepted not only the mystic influences and fatalities of astrology, but all the Kabbalistic mythology that ascribed occult significance and powers to numbers and the alphabet. The number 9 distinguishes Beatrice because its square root is the 3 made holy by the Trinity. There are 9 circles in hell, 9 levels in purgatory, 9 spheres in paradise. By and large, Dante adopts with awe and gratitude the philosophy and theology of Thomas Aquinas, but with no servile fidelity. St. Thomas would have winced at the arguments of the De Monarchia, or the sight of popes in hell. Dante's conception of God as light and love, l'amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle, the love that moves the sun and the other stars, is Aristotle carried down through Arabic philosophy. He knows something of Alfarabi, Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, Averroes. And though he assigns Averroes to limbo, he shocks orthodoxy by placing the Averroist heretic Sige de Brabant in heaven. Moreover, he puts into the mouth of Thomas words of praise for the one man who had stirred the seraphic doctor to theological wrath. Yet Sige seems to have denied that personal immortality on which Dante's poem rests. History has exaggerated either the heterodoxy of Sige or the orthodoxy of Dante. Recent studies have stressed Oriental and especially Islamic sources for Dante's ideas. A Persian legend of Ardaviraf's ascension to heaven, the descriptions of hell in the Quran, the story of Mohammed's trip to heaven, the tour of heaven and hell in Abul Ala al-Mari's Risalat al-Ghufran, the Futuhat of Ibn Arabi. In the Risalat, al-Mari pictures Iblis, or Satan, bound and tortured in hell, and Christian and other infidel poets suffering there. At the gate of paradise, the narrator is met by a Hawri, or beautiful maiden, who has been appointed his guide. In the Futuhat, Ibn Arabi, who wrote love poems with pious allegorical interpretations, drew precise diagrams of the hereafter, described hell and heaven as exactly beneath and above Jerusalem, divided hell and heaven into 9 levels, and pictured the circle of the mystic rose and choirs of angels surrounding the divine light, all as in the Divine Comedy. So far as we know, none of these Arabic writings had by Dante's time been translated into any language that he could read. Apocalyptic literature describing tours or visions of heaven or hell abounded in Judaism and Christianity, not to speak of the 6th book of Virgil's Aeneid. An Irish legend told how St. Patrick had visited purgatory and hell, and had seen there tunics and sepulchres of fire, sinners hanging head downward, or devoured by serpents, or covered with ice. In 12th century England, a priest trouvère, Adam de Ros, recounted in a substantial poem St. Paul's tour of hell under the guidance of the Archangel Michael, made Michael expound the gradation of punishments for different degrees of sin, and showed Paul trembling like Dante before these horrors. Joachim of Flora had told of his own descent into hell and ascent into heaven. There were hundreds of such visions and tales. With all this damning evidence, it was hardly necessary for Dante to cross linguistic barriers into Islam in order to find models for his Inferno. Like any artist, he fused existing material, transformed it from chaos to order, and set it on fire with his passionate imagination and his burning sincerity. He took the elements of his work wherever he could find them, in Thomas and the Troubadours, in Peter Damien's fiery sermons on the pains of hell, on his brooding over Beatrice living and Beatrice dead, in his conflicts with politicians and popes, in the scraps of science that crossed his path, in the Christian theology of the fall, the Incarnation, sin and grace, and the Last Judgment, in the Plotinian, Augustinian conception of the graduated ascent of the soul to union with God, in Thomas's emphasis on the beatific vision as the final and only satisfying goal of man. And out of these he made the poem in which all the terror, hope, and pilgrimage of the medieval spirit found voice, symbol, and form. 2. Hell. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita. Midway on the road of our life, I found myself in a dark wood whose direct way was blurred and lost. Wandering in this darkness, Dante meets Virgil, his master and guide, from whom alone I took the beautiful style that has brought me honor. Virgil tells him that the only safe exit from the wood is through hell and purgatory. But if Dante will accompany him through these, he will conduct him to the portals of paradise, where a worthier than I must lead thee. Indeed, he adds, it is at Beatrice's command that he has come to the poet's aid. They pass through an opening in the earth's surface to the gates of hell, inscribed with these bitter words, Per me si va nella città dolente, per me si va nell'eterno dolore, per me si va tra la perduta gente, giustizia mosse il mio alto fattore, fecemi la divina potestate, la somma sapienza e il primo amore, dinanzi a me non fur cose create, si non eterne ed io eterno duro. Lasciate ogni speranza, voi che entrate. Through me one enters the sorrowful city. Through me one enters into eternal pain. Through me one enters among the lost race. Justice moved my high Maker. Divine power made me, supreme wisdom and primeval love. Before me were no things created except eternal ones, and I endure eternally. All hope abandon, ye who enter here. Hell is a subterranean funnel reaching down to the center of the earth. Dante conceives it with a powerful, almost sadistic imagination. Dark and frightening abysses between gigantic murky rocks, steaming, stinking marshes, torrents, lakes, and streams, storms of rain, snow, hail, and brands of fire, howling winds and petrifying cold, tortured bodies, grimacing faces, blood-stilling shrieks and groans. Nearest the top of this infernal funnel are those who were neither good nor bad, and those who were neutral. Ignoble irritations punish them. They are bitten by wasps and hornets, gnawed by worms, consumed with envy and remorse. The never-neutral Dante scorns them, and makes Virgil say, Misericordia e giustizia gli si degna. Non ragioniam di lor, ma guarda e passa. Mercy and justice despise them. We do not speak of them, but look and pass on. The tourists come to the subterranean river Acheron, and are ferried over by old Charon, serving here since Homer's days. On the farther shore, Dante finds himself in Limbo, the first circle of hell, where stay the virtuous but unbaptized, including Virgil and all good heathen, and all good Jews except a few Old Testament heroes whom Christ, visiting Limbo, released to heaven. Their only suffering is that they eternally desire a better fate, and know that they will never receive it. There in Limbo, honored by all its denizens, are great pagan poets, Homer, Horace, Ovid, Lucan. They welcome Virgil and make Dante the sixth of their tribe. Looking still higher, says Dante, vidi il maestro di color che sano, seder tra filosofica familia. I saw the master of those who know, seated amid the philosophic family. That is, Aristotle, surrounded by Socrates, Plato, Democritus, Diogenes, Heraclitus, Anaxagoras, Empedocles, Thales, Zeno, Cicero, Seneca, Euclid, Ptolemy, Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna, and Averroes, who made the great commentary. Obviously, if Dante had had his way, all this noble company, including the Saracen infidels, would have graced paradise. Virgil now leads him down into the second circle, where carnal sinners are ceaselessly tossed about by furious winds. Here Dante sees Paris, Helen, Dido, Semiramis, Cleopatra, Tristan, and Paolo and Francesca. To end a family feud between the Polentas, lords of Ravenna, and the Malatestas, lords of Rimini, the lovely Francesca da Polenta was to wed the brave but deformed Gianciotto Malatesta. The rest of the story is uncertain. A favored version makes Paolo, the handsome brother of Gianciotto, pretend to be the suitor. To him Francesca pledged herself, but on the wedding day she found herself reluctantly marrying Gianciotto. Soon afterward she enjoyed for a moment Paolo's love. In that moment Gianciotto caught and slew them, circa 1265. Swaying in the wind as a fleshless wraith beside the ghost of her disembodied lover, Francesca da Rimini tells Dante her story. No greater grief than to remember days of joy when misery is at hand. One day, for our delight, we read of Lancelot, how him love thralled. Alone we were, and no suspicion near us. Oft times by that reading our eyes were drawn together, and the hue fled from our altered cheek. But at one point alone we fell. When of that smile we read, the wished smile, so rapturously kissed by one so deep in love, then he, who ne'er from me shall separate, at once my lips all trembling kissed. The book and writer both were love's purveyors. In its leaves that day we read no more. Dante faints with pity at this tale. He wakes to find himself in the third circle of hell, where those who were guilty of gluttony lie in mire under a continuous storm of snow, hail, and dirty water, while Cerberus barks over them and rends them piecemeal with threefold jaws. Virgil and Dante descend into the fourth circle, where Plutus is stationed. Here the prodigal and the avaricious meet in conflict, rolling great weights against each other in a Sisyphean war. The poets follow the murky boiling river Styx down into the fifth circle. Here those who sinned by wrath are covered with filth, and smite and tear themselves, and those who were sinfully slothful are submerged in the stagnant water of the Stygian lake, whose muddy surface bubbles with their gasps. The wanderers are conveyed across the lake by Phlegyas, and reach in the sixth circle the city of Dis, or Lucifer, where heretics are roasted in flaming sepulchres. They descend into the seventh circle. There, under the presidency of the Minotaur, those who committed crimes of violence are perpetually near to drowning in a roaring river of blood. Centaurs shoot them with arrows when their heads emerge. In one compartment of this circle are the suicides, including Piero delle Vigne. In another, those who committed violence against God or nature or art stand with bare feet on hot sands, while flakes of fire fall upon their heads. Among the sodomites, Dante meets his old teacher, Brunetto Latini, a tasteless doom for a guide, philosopher, and friend. At the edge of the eighth circle, a horrible monster appears, who bears the poets down into the pit of usurers. In the upper gulfs of this circle, an ingenious diversity of unending pains falls upon seducers, flatterers, and simoniacs. The latter are fixed head downward on poles, only their legs protrude, and flames lick their feet caressingly. Among the simoniacs is Pope Nicholas III, 1277 to 1280, whose evil deeds, along with those of other popes, are bitterly denounced. And by a bold fancy, Dante pictures Nicholas as mistaking him for Boniface VIII, who died in 1303, whose arrival in hell is expected at any hour. Soon, Nicholas predicts, Clement V, who died in 1314, will also come. In the fourth gulf of the eighth circle are those who presume to foretell the future. Their heads are fixed face backwards on their necks. This book is concluded on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.